Hey, I'm Sam and I do design, and in the video today I am going to be teaching you my tips for interiors in Keyshot. So recently on my Instagram I've been posting a lot of interior scenes, so I wanted to make this tutorial to try and teach you guys how to do that type of thing in Keyshot. We are going to be talking a lot about photography in this tutorial, and I would just like to say that this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online community where you can learn anything from creative skills to how to run a business. And I actually watched a lot of tutorials on photography, and that is what has got me into interior rendering in Keyshot as well. So I can give you guys 2 free months if you want to learn all about photography on Skillshare. If you click the link in the description below, 2 free months, you can cancel at any time. You can binge all of the photography classes, and learning about photography is really going to help you with renders because it's all about that theory that I'm going to touch upon. But if you want an in-depth tutorial, you can head over to Skillshare and get 2 months for free. Anyway, we're going to jump into the tutorial. You can see now that I've already got an interior set up, and I always get the question on Instagram, did I model everything in the scene? And the answer straight out the bat is no. I did not model these. I downloaded these from various places online, but I will get into that in a minute. What I want to talk about firstly is the 3 elements that make up a good photo. Those 3 elements are subject matter, composition, and lighting. And between those 3 things, that is how you get a good photo. The difference with rendering is it has an extra element, and that is materials. So the first thing that I want to do is talk about subject matter. We obviously have an interior scene here. If I come over to my geometry view, you can see that I've got this interior modeled. I modeled the actual room itself in Shaper 3D on my iPad, and then I imported all of the assets and the furniture and things like that from various sources. So it's really about dressing the scene and making sure that your subject matter is something that you're happy with. I've gone with showing a kitchen and living room open plan type of scene, and I want to focus on the plant. So mainly the plant on the table is the subject matter that I'm trying to show here, and that is what's going to draw the eye into the scene. Another way to draw an eye into the scene is by having different camera settings. So not only subject matter, you need to have it in the frame, but you need to also frame it properly with the camera settings that you've got. So I can come over here to my camera, and you can see that I'm on an 80mm lens here. And this is what I learned on Skillshare. The difference between, let's say, a 30mm lens. 30mm is what is going to start to give you more of a fisheye effect. So as a rule of thumb, humans see between 40 and 50mm, and we like the look of 80mm as well. That's as in the human eye and the brain interprets things at around 40 to 50mm. And it's all about the perspective that you get. So let's say 30mm is quite fisheye. Let's go to 10mm and really start to see the difference here. So you can really start to see the crazy fisheye effect. And then if I go up to maybe 100mm, things start to flatten out. You get a huge jump, and then 200mm, things flatten out even more. And then at 300mm, which is really not great for interior scenes, that is more for landscape or architecture or city, getting city skylines. You get this effect where the background is brought right the way up to the front, and anything in the foreground is pushed right the way to the back. So 300mm is not so great for interior, so I like to stick it on 80mm, and that tends to get a nicer sort of natural perspective, but it still looks nice and flat, doesn't look distorted. But you can play around with it. 50mm, 40mm, anything in that sort of range is going to be good for your composition. The next thing I want to talk about is depth of field. So I know I'm jumping straight into this, and I haven't really spoken about the modeling or anything like this, but like I said, it's about adding assets that you can find online really fast and effectively, so you can then really start to delve into making the scene look realistic like this. So the next thing I want to talk about is depth of field. Anything that you have in a camera is going to have depth of field. And you can see it in the geometry view over here. It's going to have a plane of focus. I'm just going to change it to wireframe so we can see. So you can see this darker blue section here is my focus area, And it's actually not even quite on the plant yet. I think I missed focus on the plant. So I think I need to change this up a little bit. So the plane of focus is anything that's going to be in focus. And as you move further away from that and closer to the camera, it's going to get slightly less in focus. So I've got an f-stop of 3. And a lower f-stop means that only a sliver of that element is going to be in focus. So you can see the 2 lines now they are symbolizing what is in focus. They are really close together now. And also over here, you can see that the rug has even started to blur out, and that's even quite close to the plant. So an f-stop of 1 is going to be not a lot of focus at all. And then an f-stop of 10 or something like that, I'm going to need to zoom out to get those indicators back. You can see that everything in the frame is going to be in focus right the way up to the edge of the rug, which we don't even see. So the difference between an f.1, an f-stop 1, and an f-stop 10 is how much focus is going to be in the image. So I'm going to stick at maybe an f-stop 1. I know that naturally I'm going to use an f1.2 because I have a 1.2 lens on my camera and I know I like that look. So I'm going to go for an f1.2 because we're trying to make a good photo just with the added element of textures as well. So it's all about trying to replicate what you would use in real life if you were photographing this scene. So I'm going to move on to where I actually got these models from now. And I got them from a variety of sources online. I'm always searching for more models so I can add that to my online collection. But I got most of these models from a website called Dimensiva, Poliigon, GrabCAD, TurboSquid, and CG Trader. I will leave all of those websites in the description below so you can go and check them out for yourself. Some of them have free models. In fact, all of them have free models. Some of them have paid models. And I find that the paid models are obviously a lot better quality. I've paid for these models, but I don't say that you need to pay for them. You can get the free models if you like to try out. But once you've practiced and once you've got the hang of these things and you want to go into it even more, then I would recommend going for those paid models because they are nicer quality and it makes your job easier when you come to light scenes and stuff like that as well. So I'll leave those down in the description below. But we're going to move on from composition now and we're going to start talking about materials. So if I said that the 3 things for a good photo is subject matter, composition, and lighting, why am I going to talk about materials before lighting? And the reason why I'm going to do that is because we need to set up the scene so that the light is bounced off each surface in the correct way. So if I set up the lighting before any of these materials were set, then as soon as I start adding lights and as soon as I start adding in different materials with different reflectiveness, then actually what's going to happen is the lighting is going to change. So let me take, for example, this wooden flooring. I'm going to be using textures from Poliigon. Poliigon is a great website for textures. It's made for Blender and rendering engines like that, but it also works in Keyshot. Now, I'm not going to go through the exact ins and outs of adding in the Poliigon textures because I know that Esben Oxholm has got an amazing tutorial on that. In fact, that's the tutorial that I needed to learn how to do it. So I'm going to link that down in the description below and you can go check out Esben's tutorial on that because it's essentially the same thing for every material. Once you've downloaded a material from Poliigon, you're going to have stuff like the color and that is going to give the material its overall color like we've got this wood down here. Now you'll notice that this may be a little bit too saturated and this is less saturated. So all I've done is added in a color adjust node in the middle of those to just drop the opacity of the color, drop the saturation, of the color, and that's going to give it a more natural, neutral tone down there. So once you have the textures from Poliigon, you can actually really start to play with them and add in all of the different details that you need on top of those things as well. So Poliigon also comes with a reflective map, and what that does is tells Keyshot what is glossy, what is matte, what is reflective, and that goes into the specular node. The gloss map, again, is all about the reflections that you will see, and that goes into the roughness panel. You have a bump map, which is going to tell Keyshot that the surface is actually bumpy, and it's going to simulate having bumps without actually adding any more geometry in as well. So this is actually just a flat plane. So you can see over here, all it is a flat plane on the floor, and I've added in this bump map, and it's going to tell Keyshot, okay, these sections where the wood paneling in between, there's a slight bump there, and Keyshot will simulate that. On top of that, we also have what is called a displacement map, and that will actually tell Keyshot to give the surface extra geometry based on the texture that it's got here. So if I double click that texture, I can press C to preview it, and it's actually not a very contrasty texture right now, but anywhere that is dark will be low, and anywhere that is light will be high. So that is how a displacement map works. That goes into a displacement mode, and you can see I've changed it to 5 millimeters with a 1 millimeter triangle size. That tells Keyshot how big the triangles are for the extra geometry it gives, and how many is the max triangles in millions. So I've already got quite a complex scene, so I've kept that at 6, which is 6 million triangles. And if I press H on the keyboard, we can bring up the display, and you can see that I've got a total of 11 million triangles, nearly 12 million triangles, which my computer can cope with. The more powerful your computer is, the more triangles it can cope with. So you need to bear that in mind if you're going to put a displacement map on every single material. Maybe it's going to overload the computer. So you need to carefully select which materials are going to need the most detail, so you can decide which ones to add the displacement maps to. I think in this scene, actually, the only thing that I've added a displacement map to is the floor, because I know that I want some really nice reflections when I turn the interior mode on, which I'm going to get to in a minute. So I've mentioned Esben Oxholm. He has some great tutorials on Keyshot and the material graph. I also want to give a quick shout out to Will Gibbons and his Material Graph Monday. I've been learning so much from that series. So you guys need to go and check that out too, because once you know how to add materials to things, then you can add them all together in a scene like this. An amazing series that I learned so much from. Let's say that we have added in all of the different materials, and now we want to start talking about the lighting. Now this is the bit that I wanted to talk about today. The lighting of the scene can add in a huge difference to the way that a scene is interpreted. So in order to set up the lighting for the scene, I'm going to need to switch over to interior mode, and that is going to tell Keyshot how to interact with the light that is bouncing around the room. Product mode is great if you're using a small product in a studio, or one-off product in a studio. But if you're adding in walls and you're adding in furniture and tables and things like that, then interior mode is going to tell Keyshot how to use that light and make it behave like it does in the real world. Before I start to set up any lighting, I'm going to change that to interior mode. Then I can come over to environment, and I'm just going to go ahead and make a new environment so we can make it from scratch. So I'm going to call this one tutorial. And the HDR editor, which is over here, is going to be where we can start to add pins to light the scene. So effectively, what the HDRI is doing is wrapping the entire scene in the image that you can see there. So if I come over to settings, I can change the background to the lighting environment. You can see that the sphere that we have made is matching the HDRI over there. So if I come in here and add a pin, you can see that on the HDRI, there's a pin there as well. So once I've added a pin, I can move it around, and that is going to move it in the environment as well. But let's say, for example, I've got 10 pins already and I want to rotate the whole thing. I can also go into the settings and rotate the whole thing without needing to go in and rotate each individual pin. So how do we simulate sunlight? Well, there are a couple of different ways to do that. Over here in the library panel, if you come down to environments, sun and sky, you can see that Keyshot comes with a few different presets for lighting that you can drag in. And then that is going to simulate, again, Los Angeles at midday. But what I like to do actually is to make my scene from scratch, because then I have more control over where each pin is. So let's say I want this pin here to be the sun. I can name this sun, and it is really important to name your pins for the exact thing that you want it to do, because once you start getting 10, 15, 20 pins, maybe that's a little bit excessive, but once you start to get a few pins, then instead of just turning them on and off all the time, you know exactly which ones you need. So the radius over here, I can change with this figure. And what we want for the sun is a really small figure here, because actually the sun is so far away, it is just a pin in the sky, but it just happens to be that it is so bright. So we need to change the radius from anything between 1, and that's going to give us some really hard shadows, and 3 or 4, and that's going to give us some softer shadows. So you can see on the side here that the shadow is pin sharp because the pin on the HDRI is tiny. And I can move that up to 3, and as the pin gets larger, so does the brightness as well. So if you increase the size of the pin, you also increase the brightness of it, so you can compensate by making the brightness slightly lower as well. I like how this is looking actually, and you can see already just with this tiny pin, one tiny pin, then the light is coming through the windows that I've got blinds set up. Again, I'm trying to replicate real life, so I'm adding in as many details as I can to replicate that real life. So I've added in some blinds here, and you can see that already on the floor, we've got this nice blinds pattern there as well. So I don't quite like the position of it. I want the sun to go and bounce some light off this back wall. So what I can do to change that is change these figures down here. So azimuth is kind of like the rotation of the sun, and that is going to change the rotation of it, and elevation is going to change the height of it. So you can see in the HDRI, if I move the elevation, the pin changes, and if I move the azimuth, it changes as well. So I'm going to move the azimuth to something like this, and I also had a nice effect with something like 20, 15. Let's check that out. Just move this a little bit more. Yeah, so now already I've got a nice, interesting effect on the back wall there, and I kind of like that. So if I come back into my cameras, I can come to my bokeh camera preset, which is the camera that I've got with f-stop. So what photographers call the blurriness in the foreground and background of images is bokeh. So yeah, I've got a camera called bokeh, and you can see already just with one pin, it's as easy as that can get you a really nice looking scene. But what I do think is that the overall scene is looking a little bit dark, right? Just with the one pin, and the background of the thing is quite gray, of the HDR is quite gray. So what you can do is change the background color, or you can even add in another pin. So I'm going to come in and add a pin to give it some area light as a whole. So I'm going to make this maybe 50. I'm going to change the fall off to 1, so it's nice and soft. And it's not going to be as bright as the sun at all. It's just going to give a little bit of extra light. So maybe let's make this 10. And that's just going to brighten the scene up just a little bit, just to give us some detail in the shadows as well. What I've also done in this scene is gone ahead and added in some area lights, some local area lights that is also lighting the scene from within as well. And I'm going to quickly talk about those now. So let's say we come over to our lamp. I've got a cylinder within the lamp, which is exactly where the light bulb would be. And all I've done is change that cylinder to an area light, and I've given it a value that is on the Kelvin scale. Now that is really important, and that is something I've forgotten to do in the HDRI. The Kelvin scale is basically simulating every single light temperature that we have in the real world. And lights inside, like indoor lights, tend to be on the warmer spectrum of things, because humans like to have a nice warm, cozy light when we have lights on in the evening. So adding a light in that is on the Kelvin scale, not just the RGB scale that's going to give you some unnatural colors, the Kelvin scale is going to make things look more natural. So I need to come back over to my environment, because I forgot to do this. I click the pin that I want to change, and you can see color is white. And there are no things in the real world that have white light. So what I need to do is come over to the color changer over here, press Kelvin, and just click anywhere in the middle, because I want it to be a neutral color still. So I'm going to press anywhere in the middle of the Kelvin scale and just press OK. Now you'll notice that the color is now a lot darker than white, so it's going to be a lot darker in general. So what I can do to compensate for that again is just change the figure to have a slightly higher figure to compensate for the fact that it's not pure white anymore. Okay, so we're just going to come back over to our scene panel, actually our material panel, and you can see that I've got this set here to lux. As a rule of thumb, you want to keep things in lux because what that does, I know that we measure in the real world, we measure in watts and lumens, but what lux does is it takes into consideration the size of the object as well. So if this object gets bigger now, it's also going to get brighter. So that's why it's such a small light, and I've got it at such a high value here. What's that, 50,000 or 5 million? I can't even see on this small screen. But you can see that the lux value is going to give us a nice area here, depending on how big that bulb is. Same again, I've just added in a piece of geometry into this shade over here, changed it to an area light, giving it a slightly warm glow on the Kelvin scale, and that's just going to bounce some light down and give us some extra details down here. So I'm going to bring this full circle now, and as this starts to res up, you can see that the reflection in the wood is being nicely defined by those 4 or 5 different textures that we put in. We had the color texture, the specular texture, the gloss, and the bump and the displacement texture, and they're all working together to give us this nice smooth but slightly bumpy reflection in the wood, and I really like that in a scene. So that's just there to give it a little bit more extra realism, along with the displacement map as well. Okay, one last thing that I'm going to fix is by having the outside visible here. So we can slightly see on the outside. So what I need to do is come over to environment, come over to settings, change the background to have just a blank color outside. And that's going to help with blending in the background there as well. What I'd like to see sometimes is maybe if I saw slightly more out the window, you can start to see the outside exterior, so a horizon or a skyline of a city. But what you need to remember in those scenarios is that we're exposing our camera, our fake camera, for the interior scene. So that means that anything on the exterior is going to be washed out and overexposed. So if you are going to put a backplate image of an exterior over there, don't forget to make sure that it is really blown out because that is what's going to make it look more realistic. Okay, I think we are now ready to render. So the render settings that I use, and I get asked this a lot, I render as large as possible. So this is 3500. That may be slightly too big for this instance. If I was going to export for Instagram, for example, all I need to do is maybe 1600 by 1202. That's because of the aspect ratio that I've got it in. But anything over 1080 for Instagram is going to be great. The options that I use for the rendering is the maximum samples. So I see some people using maximum time, which is fine to render if you have a specific deadline you need to hit. But what I like to do is maximum samples because effectively what a sample is how many times light is going to bounce around the room before it decides what color that pixel is going to be. So the more samples you have, the more accurate it's going to be. And why I use maximum samples is, let's say, for example, I've got this set up as an animation and I set it to maximum time, okay? And let's say, for example, that the camera pans across and we start to see some more stuff, some more products with more details, okay? Let's say that we pan across and we see this, he says that he can't zoom around the scene as he wants to. Let's say that we pan across and we've got some interesting and complicated materials in here, right? Let me just change this to performance mode so we can see it. And if I've got a animation and it's set to the same time each frame, as I pan around to the more complex things, it's still going to spend the same amount of time, even though it's got all of this to render inside, right? So what you see with an animation in that case is the simple bits look really good. And then as the animation moves over to the more complex bits, you can see that the quality drops within each frame. So what I like to do is just set it to the sample option. And what that means is it doesn't matter how long it's going to be. Some frames it might do in 10 seconds, some frames it might do in 5 seconds. Some frames it might do in 30 seconds, but each frame is going to be the right quality. So I can use that all the time, even in the stills as well. And 1,500 samples is a crazy amount of samples, but I really like to get a nice smooth interior scene. But you can play around with that by, let me see, I'm gonna go to my bokeh. You can play around with how many samples you need by coming up to the region and only rendering a certain specific region. So I recommend the most complex region, and if you've got the HUD up here by pressing H, you can see how many samples you've got live. So when this starts to look good, you can reference how many samples you've got up here, and you can say, okay, I only need 100 samples for it to look good. For example, I would still maybe use 150, I'd maybe still use 500 samples to 1,000 samples in a scene like this, just because we've got the blinds at the side, and we still start to get these lines that I want to get rid of by having a high sample over there as well. So at 230, you can see that it is starting to get really nice and smooth, but we still have those lines in there. So like I said, 500 to 1,000 samples, depending on the time that I have. So all I have to do in that case, I would just need to press region again, come down to options, 500, and then add to queue. And then that's essentially everything that I would do to get a render up and running. This has been a really long video, and I feel like I've spoken a lot about theory behind why I do different things without actually showing you doing them itself. But like I said, the tutorials that I have learned from, I'm linking down below. You guys can go and learn from those as well. Skillshare to learn about photography. Don't forget 2 free months, and you can cancel at any time. So I would recommend learning as much about photography as you can in those 2 months. Cancel at the end. It doesn't bother me, it doesn't bother Skillshare. At least you learned something in the process, and then you can put that knowledge into your renders as well. Don't forget to like and comment and subscribe and hit the bell button and everything else that YouTube asks you to do. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.